All right, first, welcome everyone here. Glad to see you and all the participants. I have just a quick statement that I want to read, and we'll get started. In this country, we have 5 states that exclusively vote by mail. I surmise that in the next 10 years or so, the entire country will have that option for all Americans. Voting has always been a constitutional right for all Americans, that is, for certain Americans. In the early years following America's victory after subjugation from England, only landowners who were men, white men that is, were allowed to vote. Over the course of more than a century and a half, there has been wars fought and constitutional amendments enacted to allow all citizens the right to vote. As a Black child, I sat and listened to my father and ancestors relate the accounts and stories how Black people were denied the opportunity to vote, whether it was by a heinous ploy such as poll tax or guessing the number of jelly beans in a jar, or stating if your grandfather owned land, you could vote. Neither were women excluded from this prohibition. For prior to 1920, women were not allowed to vote, not to mention 18-year-olds to go to war and defend their nation. Before Vietnam War, they were denied the opportunity to vote. My point is, as Americans, we should always look to afford opportunities for citizens to vote. We should aspire to be creative and innovative, encouraging and enlisting those eligible to participate in the American experiment, engaging all to be involved to enhance this nation. Voting by mail is not a new concept. As I said earlier, a number of states have been exclusively using the process for many years, and in fact, utilizing absentee voting for as long as one can remember. It was and it remains common practice for those of us who served and are serving in the military. There will be those who will say it opens the door for significant fraud. However, the data does not reflect that assertion. In America, we have prided ourselves in being the most innovative and creative nation on the face of the earth. We should strongly desire full participation in our elections, and if this system of voting by mail increases the participation, we should welcome it, and if it needs tweaking, we should work together to fix it. This evening, we are privileged to have 5 panelists who will address the national topic, vote by mail. Anthony Harris, Senior Pastor, St. John's Church. Steve Land, Democratic Party Chairman, Party County. Sonya Letson, President of the Annual League of Women Voters. Kim Revell, Medical Doctor and Republican Party Chair, Randall County. Dan Rogers, Republican Party Chairman, Potter County. And finally, Mariah Strong Woods, Democratic Party Chairman from Randall County, was unable to be here tonight because she is out of state. So with that, I would be gracious now to turn this over to Karen Welch, who is our moderator for the Panhandle Broadcasting System. Karen, it's all yours.
Thank you, Commissioner Vaughn. Good evening. I am Karen Welch. I'm Senior Content Producer, for Panhandle PBS, and we welcome our panelists and those of you joining us online. As we all know, the coronavirus pandemic has prompted many states to re-examine their plans to conduct the November election safely. Election Day is set for November 3rd. This evening, we'll delve into questions surrounding vote by mail and related topics. Opinions expressed in this forum are solely those of the participants and do not express the views or opinions of Panhandle PBS or Amarillo College. First, let's start by asking each panelist in a random order to make a brief opening statement. Dan, let's start with you.
Well, I think first we need to differentiate between what absentee voting is and mail-in voting or vote by mail. In my opinion, it needs to be a better option than in-person voting. It needs to guarantee that every vote is counted. It needs to be safe and secure and cannot be compromised in any way. That guarantees every vote is counted, whether they be the Green Party, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, or any other party. I believe that every voter matters and every vote must be counted. I believe our current system is good. Why is our current system in Texas being challenged, and who desires to change it and why? I believe that one party is trying to confuse the electorate and wants to make it look as if there is a risk of contracting a deadly virus should you vote. They're trying to scare the voter. But I believe that voting in person is much more safe as the voting centers are clean, the machines are wiped down, and a simple touch of a clean, virus-free screen is much safer than a mail-in ballot where there's no way to know where that ballot has been. But we do know that it travels through the postal system, is handled by numerous people, and could be handled by numerous people and households, and could not only be compromised, but voted on by others, but the viruses can adhere to that ballot, infect everyone who makes contact with it, and could spread the virus like wildfire throughout our state. So to me, it makes zero sense to expose voters, their family members, the postal workers, election workers, ballot board members, etc., to this deadly virus. So the proposition for mail-in ballots is irrational and in fact puts our whole society at risk.
Thank you, Dan. Steve Land, we'll go with you now. Your microphone is still muted. Kyle?
Thank you. I wanted to start with a statement of what the current situation is. To be eligible to vote by mail in Texas, you must be either 65 years of age or older, be disabled, be out of the country on election day and during the period for early voting, or be confined in jail but otherwise eligible. The Texas Attorney General and the courts have ruled at this time that fear of contracting COVID-19 does not constitute a disability for voting by mail under the current Texas election code. However, if you have a condition or something that makes you more likely to contract COVID-19, you may claim a disability. A list of conditions that make you more susceptible can be found on the CDC website. In Amarillo, we have websites sponsored by both Potter and Randall counties, which have an application for mail-in ballots. It's very easy to use. The two websites are PotterCountyVotes.com and RandallCountyVotes.com. Thank you.
Mr. Revell, you're up.
Yes. There is already a system that is pretty much foolproof for mail-in ballots in Texas. Steve is right that there are criteria, and the only ones that I would probably add to that is if someone is a long haul driver and is going to be out of the state or out of the area, and offshore oil workers could probably benefit from that. But the fact is that in Texas, most of the election heads monitor ballots pretty closely. In Randall County, in March, there were 2,000 mail-in ballots. Then it went up on the 14th to 28, or excuse me, that was 2,000 ballots. It went up to 2,800 in the July election. So there is an increasing number of people that would like to do that. The only problem is that in the in-person voting, no one can be coerced, and nobody can be defrauded of their vote. Where if there's not an election supervisor around to do that, there's always a chance of coercion or just substitution.
Thank you. Ms. Letson, it's your turn.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here on the panel tonight. My name is Sonya Letson. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Amarillo. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization. We have over 700 leagues across the country, both local and state leagues. And we have been in existence for 100 years. So we have about 100 years as a group of experience with voting rights and voting issues. The league was formed out of the struggle for the vote for women, which took 70 years before women gained the vote in 1920. Our goal is to see that every eligible citizen can vote, does vote, and their vote counts. We want voting to be easy and not hard. In this time of pandemic, the key, we believe, is to have as many options on how to vote as we can. And we'll talk, I know, in detail about that more in just a bit. You know the League of Women Voters from our voters' guides. We produce those before elections, and that's what you pick up at the library to find out about the candidates. You also know us for our candidate forums. We'll have another one this year that Panhandle PBS is going to produce for us. And you know us for our voter registration efforts. I'd also like you to know the League for our online voters guide and all things voting site, which is vote411.org. I am glad to be here for this discussion. There's a lot to talk about. I'm excited for us to delve deeply into the issue of voting by mail.
Thank you. Mr. Harris?
Good evening, everyone. 18 years ago, I moved to the state of Washington. And state of Washington is one of the 5 states that has full vote by mail. When I first moved there in 2003, they were still going to the polls with a combination of vote by mail. In 2004, the legislature decided to go fully vote by mail. And what they did in 2004 was send out a postcard for all legal registered voters who are eligible to vote. Upon that, you filled out your name, all your information, address, and assured them that you were a citizen of the United States along with your signature. Once you did that, you mailed it back in. And in 2005, the state of Washington became fully mail-in vote. And the thing I loved about the mail-in vote was that a month before the voting process, they would send out to you your ballot along with a voter pamphlet with the information of all the candidates, their bio, their platform, their voting history, whether it was a judge, any bond legislation, any of that. You knew all the pros and cons of what they wore. At the conclusion of filling out your ballot, you would sign an affidavit stating that it was you. You would put it into an envelope, seal that envelope, and it would be a different color. You would sign that across the flap, put it into another envelope, and then drop it into a drop box so it never had to go through the mailing system. And so when I began to look at that process, and I did some more research, and the Harrington Foundation has done some research on this, and they have discovered that in the state of Washington, they have not had any fraud or criminal fraud charges since 2010. That's 10 years since any fraud has been detected. Where here in the state of Washington or state of Texas, in 2018, there were eight cases of criminal fraud, not all of them by absentee ballot or mail-in votes. And I'm out of time. So I will get into more of the data. I'm welcome to share that versus Washington versus what we have here, and go from there.
Thank you. In an effort to get as many questions in as possible and allow each of you to be heard, we're going to ask you to keep your answers to 60 seconds or less. Because most of our discussion will be focused on Texas, I want to begin with 2 questions about the voting experience in Washington state so that then we can go on to local matters. So, Mr. Harris, please tell us, these questions will first be addressed to you and the panel, and then the panelists will weigh in as I call on them. Washington is one of those 5 states that currently conduct all elections by mail. Talk a little bit more about how it has worked there, and panelists, as I call on you, please weigh in on the merits or flaws you see in the process.
So the security of the Washington, and as it is with the other 5 states, is it's almost impossible to commit any kind of fraud or have any interference from another country. Every year, the ballot that you get is a different size. The weight of the paper is different. And so for anyone to really engage in any kind of fraud, they would have to know that. The color of the envelopes change depending on the county, depending on the city. They can change, they rotate, the size of the envelopes change. And so you would have to know all of that in order to engage in any kind of fraud. And so that made me feel very comfortable. The other thing is you have plenty of time to be able to know the issues, firmly know the issues, understand the issues, and properly take the time that was necessary to fill out your ballot. And so, as I said, 2010 was the last time, according to the Harrington Foundation, that there was any fraud there in the state of Washington.
Thank you. Mr. Land?
Well, I read that California has a barcode they employ on their mail-in ballot, which ensures a tracking for the ballot as it comes from the residence all the way to the election office. And people can even see the route that the envelope is taking. I don't know if it's Washington or Oregon. They have started employing artificial intelligence to compare the signatures on the ballot to the signatures on the voter registration. All of this boils down to it being very, very difficult to perpetrate any fraud.
Thank you. Mr. Revell?
Yes, one of the things that you really have to rely on is the goodness of each individual and their mental acuity. Being a physician and having worked in hospice and in nursing homes for 43 years, sometimes you find people that can talk very fluently with you for a moment or two, but then the next minute they're 1,000 miles away mentally. And so one of the things that I fear is that people will be coerced to do the mail-in ballots and not vote their will.
Ms. Letson?
There are a number of best practices that states that have all mail-in voting use. And some of those have been mentioned. The tracking systems have been mentioned, signature verification with some kind of third-party software. Also, a bipartisan review of any signature mismatches. There should be outreach to voters that are flagged in the process in order to cure any defects or address whether their ballot was in fact made by them. Drop boxes are important, and a robust in-person voting opportunity as well. So Texas does not have most of these processes. However, our mail-in ballot system has been in place for decades, is used by many of our citizens with great success. And so while these are best practices, they're not the only way to do it.
And Mr. Rogers?
Well, if we're talking about Washington State, the indication is that there's been nobody prosecuted for fraud, but that could be because of a number of issues, such as a weak attorney general. To me, there would be no way to catch fraud in a mail-in voting system, and that's the problem with it, because anybody could pay somebody to vote a certain way and mail it in. There's just a myriad of ways that could be compromised, and nobody would have any idea that it was being done, and that's the problem with it. you know. There's just way too many things that can go wrong. It's not necessary. Our system is not broke, so why should we fix it? And not only that, with the virus going around, I just think that could spread the virus, like I said earlier. So why would you want to take that risk and harm the people?
And I'm asked to remind folks that are listening and watching to remember that we'll have the Q&A at the end of the first hour of this forum. The next question will be, continuing along that line, Mr. Harris, please talk about those, well, you've already done that, the security measures. So let's have some rebuttal to what Dan Rogers said. Mr. Harris, we'll go around the horn one more time.
So the fact is, when you sign that and you put it into the data machine to count your vote, immediately a barcode is read that attaches that with you. Your signature is compared with the one that you had signed on the postcard. Any discrepancy, that ballot is kicked out. And immediately the election commissioner will call you to ask if you have voted. You will let them know. They will then have you come down to verify that that is your ballot. That's why there's been no fraud there, because they're very strict in the process of making sure of who has voted. Also, in regards to when you talk about bribery, here in Texas in 2018, most of the cases that were voter frauds were by campaigns who bribed people, who assisted people at the polls. Again, if you go to the Harrington Foundation, you'll see these cases. You can read the cases, and you'll discover that at the end of the day, the amount of fraud nationwide is 0.0000.6. That's based on 250 million ballots that have been cast over the last 20 years. So when you think about that, that's very small amount of people who commit fraud.
If it was a pandemic, that would be, if it was a virus, that would be considered pandemic. Right?
Mr. Revell.
Yes. While in all that may be true, I think that, like I said earlier, that we're allowing or we're relying on the human's best traits to play fair and be fair and those sorts of things. But just recently in Los Angeles, there were a group that was arrested because they were offering the homeless people money to vote. And so that incentive has not gone away and probably will never go away. And there will inherently be some fraud, even if it isn't caught.
Mr. Land?
The statistic I heard was Oregon, since its inception in the year 2000, I believe, up until the year 2016, had around a dozen cases of fraud, and there were approximately 200 million votes cast. That's not a significant enough number to be relevant in any discussion.
Mr. Rogers?
Yeah, well, to me, that's just, I could come up all evening with questions why I don't think that's a good idea. What about people that get ballots, mail them in, and they don't get to the election administrator? How do you know that every single ballot is got there? The way we do it in Texas works. The way they do it in Washington State may work for them, but I don't think we should look at other states. I think we're capable of coming up with our own system and let them do it however they wish. But anything that goes into a third party, to me, you have opened it up to all kinds of opportunities for people's ballot not to be counted. And when people tell me, oh, it's statistically insignificant because we only lose a couple hundred ballots or whatever, what if that's your ballot? Why should we take that risk? I think it's wrong to even think that way. And it kind of irritates me that we have that lackadaisical attitude about, well, so what if a postal jeep gets ran over by a semi and bursts into flame and 3 ballots burn up? Those ballots
Thank you.
are important.
Thank you. Ms. Letson, I'll let you have the last word on this one.
Okay. We need to remember that voting by mail has been around since the Civil War. This is how our military vote. Our overseas residents vote this way. Many of our seniors in senior living centers vote this way. While improprieties or irregularities in voting can happen whether in person or by mail, still the numbers of those for both in person and by mail ballots are exceedingly small, infinitesimal. And it's not that it doesn't matter how many votes were lost, it's that the system as a whole is very safe. The president today said that voting by mail was safe and secure, at least in the state of Florida that he mentioned. And I think our citizens can rely on it. Many of them have been using it for a long time.
Thank you. Recently, the U.S. Supreme Court denied a request from Texas Democrats to expand access to vote by mail in the state amid the pandemic. The Democrats had sued Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, a Republican, arguing that voters shouldn't have to choose between their right to vote and their health. Paxton contended that expanding access to mail voting could lead to voting irregularities. Why is the push for mail-in voting happening now, and did the Supreme Court get this decision right? Ms. Letson?
Well, the push for mail-in voting is happening now because of the nature of the virus. So the virus is spread, as we understand it, by contact with other people through the air, and so gathering in large groups or lines to vote is problematic. So hence the interest in mail-in voting. The Supreme Court's decision was helpful to voters in this respect. The Supreme Court told Texas voters that they decide whether or not they have a condition that qualifies them to vote by mail. And if they have such a condition and that there would be a likelihood of injuring their health by going in person, they may apply for a mail-in ballot. There is still litigation in the federal courts about this issue. The Texas officials did not elect to expand mail-in voting to all voters, but all but 5 states in the country did that because of the pandemic.
Mr. Rogers?
Yeah, I think they made the right decision, but I still think that it's a big concern. You know, they're saying they need it to protect themselves from the virus, when I think that mail-in ballots could be the mechanism by which the virus gets transmitted all over the state and possibly the country. So I think it's looking at it the wrong way.
Mr. Land?
The Supreme Court in Texas ruled ruled against the Democratic Party in that. Real quickly, the judge in the case was Fred Bieri, and he said this was a federal court judge below the Supreme Court. He said he had concerns for the health and safety of voters and stated that the right to vote should not be elusively based on the whims of nature. 240 years on, Americans now seek life without fear of pandemic, liberty to choose their leaders in an environment free of disease, and the pursuit of happiness without undue restrictions. Continuing, he added, there are some among us who would, if they could, nullify those aspirational ideas to return to the not-so-halcyon and not-so-thrilling days of yesteryear of the divine right of kings, trading our birthright as a sovereign people for a modern mess of governing pottage in the hands of a few.
Thank you.
Resting in the oligarchy and forfeiting America.
I have to cut you off for time, Mr. Land. Thank you. Mr. Revell, excuse me.
Yes. I think that one of the things that has the electorate very upset is the pandemic, and this has been enhanced by the media. I got a note from the CDC 3 days ago, saying that even the common cold could cause a positive COVID response on the test. So if you ask someone what the real facts are, according to Unbiased America, the reality is that 1% of the population in America has the virus, and 0.04 persons dies from the virus. So I think that it is drastically overrated.
Is that, let me ask you a follow-up question. Is that deaths per capita? I mean, deaths per case or deaths per population?
No, it is deaths that have died in the US.
Per case or per capita? I mean, per population?
It's per population.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make sure that statistic was clear.
0.08% of the population commits suicide every year.
There are 1,000 people a day dying of coronavirus.
Okay, I'm going to call this back. It's Mr. Harris's turn.
I just want to point out, and I think it's worth noting, Pew Research Center poll on April 20th, 2020 did a poll, and they found that more than 70% of Americans think that voting by mail is something we ought to do in the midst of this pandemic. Ironically, 49% of Republicans agree with that nationwide. Now, when you break it down to the states that have vote by mail exclusively, over 70% of Republicans agree and like the idea of voting by mail. And what they discovered in this Pew Research poll was, as people understood what mail-in voting is and how it works and the security of it, they preferred that as opposed to going out to the polls. Because what we're seeing in a lot of cases, especially here in Texas, is people are coercing people at the polls, bribing people as they go in. And so again, as someone who is a former Republican turned independent, I like
Mr. Harris.
I like voting by mail.
Thank you. Let's move on. As he did for the July runoff, Governor Greg Abbott has extended the in-person early voting period for November 3rd by 6 days. Early voting will now begin on October 13th instead of the 19th, and the end date remains October 30th. Is that a sufficient increase in voter access during a pandemic, and why or why not? Mr. Land? Oh, you're muted.
Thank you again. I don't really know that it's going to make a tremendous amount of difference. I think more people will come to early voting, and they will cast their votes. I don't think that the problem is anything. Well, the elections administrator is going to have to staff more people, do more work, and it's going to add to the elections cost and the overall confusion. How many people know when it opens? It's going to be hard to publish out. There are a lot of problems with it.
Excuse me, I lost my place. Ms. Letson.
We were very glad to see the governor extend early voting by 6 days. The ability to choose whether to vote in person or by mail is important for voters to have. And by having both things available and a long early voting period, we can reduce crowds and lines on election day, and the mail-in ballots help to do that also. So is that enough time? It would have been nice to see a month, but Mr. Land is right. We put a lot of strain on our election administrators to find poll workers. And we saw in this primary season that polls closed across Texas because of lack of poll workers. So the league is encouraging everybody who can be a poll worker to contact your election administrator and offer to do that. We need younger poll workers and those who are not concerned about the possibility. Our administrators are doing a good job of keeping those in-person places safe, so please do sign up to help with voting.
Mr. Rogers? Oh, you're muted.
I'm sorry.
That's fine.
The extension of early voting, I think, is a good compromise. Even, I don't think that the polling places will be overcrowded. I hope they are, because I want every person eligible that's informed to go vote. We want their vote counted, and I think that Governor Abbott made a good call.
Thank you. Mr. Harris? Again, everybody check your mute before you start.
I agree with Mr. Rogers. I think Governor Abbott done a terrific job in extending the early voting. And I think as long as we continue to be inclusive and continue to progress, I think there's good compromise that can be made with the mail-in ballot as well as going to the poll. And I'll say this, when I first started doing mail-in ballot, it felt weird. I did not like it because I enjoyed the process of going to the poll and going into a booth, what I saw my parents do when I was a little boy. And so it is awkward getting used to the mail-in. Again, for me, either way we do it, as long as we make sure that everybody has their right to vote is my main priority. Make sure that everybody has that right.
Thank you. Mr. Revell?
Yes, the other thing that has not been mentioned is that here we do have curbside voting. And if you call before and tell them that you are coming, or call when you're in the parking lot, they will come to your car with an iPad to vote. And that goes directly into the system. So the person that is at the curbside cannot touch anything on the iPad while you are voting, and you have cast your vote with the last stroke.
Thank you. This question is relevant in a pandemic. In Texas, if you should become ill on or after the deadline to apply for a mail-in ballot, you can still obtain an emergency mail-in ballot. But let me describe the process for you. The voter should print and fill out the form, get a doctor to fill out and sign the same form, find someone who can drive the application to the county election administrator's office after the early voting period, but before 5 p.m. on election day, to be approved, and receive the emergency mail-in ballot, fill it out, and have someone deliver it by 7 p.m. on election day. This is all while someone is ill. So does it have to be this complicated, or what improvements could be made? Let me start with Mr. Harris.
Could you repeat that one more time, please? Make sure I got exactly.
The voter okay, if you become ill and it's after the deadline to apply for a mail-in ballot, the voter should print out and mail and fill out a form, get his doctor to fill out and sign the same form, find someone who can drive it drive the application to the county election administrator's office after the early voting period, but before 5 p.m. on election day to be approved, and then receive the emergency mail-in ballot, fill it out, and have someone deliver it before 7 p.m. on election day.
From my perspective, in doing something like that, the individual who becomes sick or ill, you're putting them at risk of not being able to get a ballot in at all, in my opinion. You're also asking someone else to take the ballot for them. Now, in rebuttal to Tim and Dan and maybe whoever else, you're asking then, is that person going to be reliable to get your ballot in and in on time? To me, that's a lot of hoops to jump through. And to me, there's a lot more chance of fraud there than it would be if you just had your traditional mail-in vote.
Mr. Revell?
Yes, I agree, because anytime that you get that ballot into a third person's hand, other than at the election administrator's office, it becomes suspect. And we have a very detailed measures in the election office to verify signatures, address, and then also the vote by 3 different sets of hands. And there's more than 2 people in each group.
Okay. Mr. Rogers?
Well, here we go again. You have a sick person who knows has what disease, getting a mail-in ballot and handing it in to the election administrator. So yes, I think it ought to be somewhat difficult because you're putting all the election workers at risk. Plus, now I have a little different idea on that. I just don't believe in mail-in anything. I don't trust the mail. Now, in Amarillo, they do a pretty good job. But across the country, I just think it's putting a burden on the Postal Service that doesn't need to be there. And I think that if somebody needs help getting a ballot to the polls and they can't make it, or they're sick, or they're unable to leave their home, they ought to send a representative from both parties together to that house and do like Tim suggested with curbside voting, allow that person to vote. They both take that back to the voting center or the election administrator or wherever it needs to go together. And then there's no question there can be no fraud.
Thank you. Mr. Land? Oh, check your microphone again.
All right. Thank you. I really feel like if a person's sick, those are an awfully huge amount of hoops for anyone to jump through. It would be difficult for a healthy person to get the doctor to sign the form that the elections administrator provides, and all of the transport with all of that. I really don't have an answer for that problem, but the current solution I don't feel like would be workable if you were sick.
Thank you. We are about at our time to start question and answers. Let me do a quick question for you all about, although he has voted by mail, President Trump has questioned the integrity of mail-in ballots, although what he said today about Florida is a different position. Mail voting occurs in both Democrat and Republican-led states, and GOP officials in Georgia, Idaho, Kentucky, Nebraska, Ohio, South Dakota, and West Virginia currently are looking at expanding mail-in voting. How do you view the statements of President Trump regarding election integrity? And I'll start with you, Mr. Rogers.
Well, I can't speak for the president, but if you're asking me my personal opinion, I think I've made it clear I am totally 100% against mail-in ballots. Maybe I don't understand it, but to me it's just too much opportunity for things to go wrong. They tried it in New York, and look at the mess on the race they have up there, the June 23rd race, 2 congressional districts. They cannot yet determine the winner because there's so much confusion over counting of the ballots. And if you get all the people in Texas, 16 million people voting by mail, that's going to so overwhelm the system. And I think the thing that could happen is it throws the whole election into a quandary, and it would take months to count it, and nobody will know who won the election. And I think that's really what the goal is, probably. Try to confuse everybody so nobody knows who wins the election.
Mr. Land?
I really don't know how Florida is achieving what they're achieving. And I don't know the basis for why Mr. Trump is praising them in particular. So I'm going to kind of pass on that question.
Okay. Mr. Revell?
Yes, I think that would be my position on it. I wholeheartedly agree with the thing that you can get a mail-in ballot if you're infirmed or over 65, or you're a college student and won't be in your area, can't be in your area due to your college. But I think just opening this up to general mail-in ballot is a can of worms that we don't need to go into.
Mr. Harris?
I would say that it would be very difficult for the state of Texas at this point in stage in the game to really be prepared to do mail-in ballot. If you recall, when I talked about the state of Washington, in 2003, they made a decision to go to mail-in ballots. And then in 2004, they sent out the registration cards to everybody. You filled them out, you sent them back in. And then they were preparing and ramping up to have drop boxes and all the bases covered along with the database. Everything had to be loaded up into the database to make sure your signature matched when it went through the computer. And so I would think it'd be awful difficult at this late in the game for Texas or any state, even though I'm aware that 46 of the 50 states are looking to do some form of mail-in ballot this year. But I think it would be awful difficult at this late in the game to really get prepared to do that efficiently.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Letson?
I agree with Reverend Harris that the troubles you saw in the primary elections with mail-in ballots were largely due to the fact that states ramped that up and they had not put that infrastructure in place over years like the 5 states that do almost exclusively mail-in ballots have done. And so Texas, it would not work probably for Texas to go to all mail-in ballots, but of course, that's not what's necessary. What's necessary is that people have the option to do one or the other. Many people will choose to vote in person. Many voters would rather vote in person. But for safety during this time of pandemic, our position has been that people should have that option. One good thing we have going for us in the United States is we have both Republican and Democratic state election administrators. And generally, they universally agree that mail-in ballots should be available.
Okay. Thank you very much, panelists. Let's now take some questions and answers and give answers to the audience. We'd like to keep these again to 60 seconds or less, and we may shorten that to pack more in, but I'll give you a warning. There's a question from someone in the audience that says, I've been a poll worker in Potter County for about 15 years. I have witnessed family members in line telling each other how to vote. Even if you ask them not to, they can still do this while driving to the polls, walking up to it, or while in line. How is this different from a relative coercing someone when using mail-in ballots? Let me start with you, Rogers.
Because when they're in that polling place, they have to produce identification, and we know who they are. And we know that they're the right voter. And there's nothing wrong with that. If people want other people's opinion, nothing wrong with that. But if they're in a household and somebody says, hey, I'll pay you $10 to vote a certain way, they don't know the difference. How do you know that's not going to happen?
Thank you. Mr. Harris?
In In Texas, that happens on a regular basis at the polling place. And as I stated, in this Mission City, Texas, campaign bribed people with money to go and vote, and they were actually convicted. And so it happens more so at the polling place, more so than voting by mail. I'm not saying it can't happen by voting by mail, but we have clear cases, according to the Heritage Foundation, that it happens on a regular basis in polling places where people are bribed either going in or while in the polling booth to vote one way or another. And that's illegal. It's against the law. And we ought not be convincing people on how to vote at the polling booth or at home.
Mr. Land?
A lot of the problem with the coercion at the polls is that people don't understand the nature of doing that or not doing that. They don't understand that that's something that's not allowed. That's the only piece of it that I can see that could stand improvement is the education of the voter as he comes in, so that the people know that they can't tell their auntie how to vote inside the poll. Outside the poll, they can do whatever they want. But that sacrosanct 100-foot diameter needs to be maintained.
Thank you. Ms. Letson?
I guess I would agree with the author of the question that this is a problem that transcends the question of whether mail-in or in-person voting is best. Both should be available. This kind of problem can happen either way, I think. Ideally, with more education and more understanding, people understand they can vote how they want to vote in whatever way is available for them to vote.
Mr. Revell?
Yes, and this would go for people that are paying other people to vote a certain way. Once they get inside that booth, nobody knows how they voted. So they could vote the way that the person that paid them to vote, they could vote that way, or they could vote the other way. Nobody knows, because they are the ones alone that are casting the vote. Where if somebody is doing it at home or out on the street, same thing could happen, is that the coercion could happen.
Okay, we have two questions that want to address the wearing of masks at the polls, and we've kind of combined them here. Voting takes place in closed spaces. If someone talks, coughs, or sneezes, they can release virus into the air that can last longer than on paper. So where is that concern in your thinking and comparing it to the dangers of mail-in voting, and does it not have the same risk? Let's start with you, Mr. Land.
I understood that at the beginning of the pandemic, February, March, they didn't know whether the virus was being transmitted from surfaces or from aerosol. And now they're more and more confident that it's mostly aerosol, people breathing on the other, the mist of their faces. And so if someone comes into the polls not wearing a mask, it just seems like there should be a mandate from the governor, which there is not, to have people mask up when they come into the polls. That's my answer to it.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Letson?
The governor did exempt polling places in his order requiring masks to be worn in public. The league's position is that poll workers, poll watchers, those working the polls should be required to wear a mask, and that voters who come into the polls should on their own wear a mask out of courtesy for other people and to protect their health. But at least that the governor's order should be amended to require poll workers and poll watchers to be masked.
Mr. Harris.
I agree with Sonya that I believe that the poll workers, without question, should have to wear a mask. I would hope that all others would, just to protect not only themselves, but others. I think it's common sense. You're only there for a few minutes, and so I think it's the wise thing to do on everybody's part to protect one another.
Thank you. Mr. Revell?
Yes. The thing that disturbs me about this whole situation is how arbitrary the mask and requirements are being upheld. For example, in Georgia, the recent funeral, Georgia has a 14-day sequestering. There were many officials, even from Washington, that flew down for the funeral, did not sequester themselves, went to the funeral and then left. Even at the funeral of Mr. Floyd in Houston, 2 weeks before the Republican convention, they were not masked, and yet they canceled the Republican convention there in Houston.
Thank you. We have another question from an attendee that due to the abysmal level of voter participation, what would be the best and safest way to increase the level of voter participation in our elections? Sonya, let's start with you, Ms. Letson.
Oh my goodness, there are a lot of things that we could do to increase voter participation. One would be to have online registration. Texas is one of only 9 states that doesn't allow people to register to vote online. We should have automatic voter registration. When people become of age or when they apply and get their driver's license, we should make it easy for them to register and get to vote. We should have no excuse mail-in ballots. If people wanted to do their ballot by mail, they should be able to, especially in this time of pandemic. And we should make sure that we have sufficient polling places across the community for people to be able to go and vote. There were many, many poll closures across the state of Texas. Texas led the South in number of polling place closures in 2018. So we need to make sure there are enough places to go vote.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers?
Well, I think it's incumbent upon the parties to educate their voters and to get them to the polls. You know, in our recent runoff election, there's 9 races, 9 other runoff elections in the state of Texas for U.S. Congress. And I think we should be pretty proud of the people in our District 13. The average of those other 9 was 4% voter turnout, and ours was 16. We had a 400% higher turnout for the people in the Panhandle than the rest of the state. So that tells you that the voters here are taking the candidates seriously and are getting involved. And I think it's the responsibility of both parties to make that happen. So to make it easier and just register anybody, I don't think makes sense, because that adds burden to the state and the local election administrators for dealing with people that don't want to vote. So I think everybody that wants to vote should vote, but I believe we should have a separate ID for voting issued by each county.
Thank you.
With a photo ID on it.
Thank you. Mr. Land, I haven't gone to you yet, have I?
No. The only thing I can say is I want to ditto what Sonya said. There are a number of things we can do to enhance the voting environment, and electronic registration, automatic registration, the entire gamut of everything she said is totally where I am too.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Revell?
Yes, one of the things that I think we can do is to teach our students more about the need to vote and what a privilege it is. I think all of us can remember several years ago where the people in a couple of the African countries were holding up their purple thumbs because they thought it was such a neat deal. I think that the only way that we're going to increase voter turnout is to make sure that our young people that are coming up realize the importance of their vote.
Thank you. And Mr. Harris?
I agree with Mr. Revell. I think one of the things we have dropped the ball is in our high school, I remember growing up, civics was taught. The importance of participating in the voting process. And those are some of the things we've not educated our high school students of the value and importance of voting and why it's so important. Also, I would agree that, and one of the things they do there in the state of Washington, the moment you turn 18, you are automatically registered to vote. And you are sent out a postcard, you fill that out, send it back in, and that will tell if a person is serious about engaging in their civic duty of voting. And so I think there needs to be a way to automatically register people to vote, educate people on the importance of voting, the value of voting, and why that makes a difference. And whether most of us know it or not, most of us here do, the importance of voting locally impacts us more so than nationally.
Thank you very much. We still have questions about face masks and the polls. So this probably is just a 30-second answer, but should poll workers wear face masks while working the polls? Let me start with Mr. Revell.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Harris.
Yes.
Mr. Rogers.
I think that the county judge and along with the county commissioners should make that decision. It is not the governor's responsibility nor authority because all elections are at the county level. And I think the county judge and the county commissioners, maybe in consultation with the county chairs, should make that decision.
I understand, but the answer, the question is, do you think poll workers should wear masks?
I think that's up to the, whoever's running that poll. Whatever the election judge determines, then that's what the poll workers should do. And I think most people are going to say yes, but it's not up to me to make that decision. Thank you.
Mr. Land?
I absolutely think that the poll workers should wear a mask. It's a safety measure for themselves and for others. And it's being respectful of others when they do that. There was a county in East Texas which the one party showed up without masks. The other party walked out. They did not close the poll, but the protest was evident.
Ms. Letson?
Yes, they should.
Thank you. I have another question from someone who has been a poll worker that asks, have you ever done curbside voting? I have. As a poll worker, it would not be practical to carry out for voters en masse. So how do you deal with the juxtaposition of if they could have a mail-in ballot versus whether the polls can actually handle election workers going out to do curbside voting? Let's start with Steve Land.
All right. I firmly believe that all the safety measures that can possibly be done should be put into effect. If the situation is not safe, the poll worker has no choice. It's their legal obligation to let that person vote. And so it's a tough dilemma to put someone in that case. I'm glad I don't have to make that decision.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers?
So could you please rephrase the question?
The question was, how do you balance, I guess, the decision about mail-in voting versus having the curbside voting, which may take more time and poll workers' resources. We have a poll worker who says she doesn't believe it could be done en masse.
Well, I disagree with that poll worker, and I don't have a problem with curbside voting. I think that's a good thing, and we can make accommodations to make that happen, and we have in our counties here. And I think it's much safer than mail-in voting, because I think we can make the case that the ballots are much dirtier and full of viruses and germs than anything else.
Ms. Letson?
I think the concern about having too many people drive up to have curbside could be well taken if you had a lot of people who wanted to do that curbside. That way to vote is designed for people who have a disability, and going into the polling place could create a likelihood of injuring their health. And so it doesn't apply to just any voter that wants to avoid being in the polling location, whereas a mail-in ballot could be used by healthy voters if it was available to them to avoid placing themselves in the polling place with a lot of other people. So I think we have to be mindful that we don't have unlimited poll workers.
Thank you. Mr. Revell?
Yes, the cost factor, while in all it should be taken into effect, it costs a little over $2 just to process a mail-in ballot. Between the mailing in and out twice when the person asks for it, and then the extra credentialed people that have to verify the signature, address, and then the vote.
Thank you. Mr. Harris?
I'm not opposed to curbside voting. I think it can be helpful. Again, I always go back to, I think we ought to make accessible to everyone the opportunity to vote. I'm a big proponent that everyone should be able to vote in whatever manner is best for them. Again, I don't understand the argument against, because I've not yet heard anyone argue against the 0.00006 nationwide fraud. There's no way anyone can convince me that there's more fraud with mail-in than in person, not when the data bears out the difference. And so I'm not opposed to this curbside. I think at the end of the day, all of us on this panel here ought to want the process to be available for everyone to vote in whatever manner is deemed safe and secure.
Thank you. We have another one. A recent study published in The Lancet found that coronavirus only lives for 3 hours on paper. It's possible that the virus's lifespan would be shorter in real-world conditions. What evidence do you have that the virus could be spread through the mail? Let's start with Mr. Rogers.
Well, that's the problem. We don't know. And the data keeps changing, and they keep telling us one thing. Then they tell us that we're going to have to do away with cash because it's so dirty and transfers the virus. So I think most people hang on to their money more than 3 hours. So we don't know. To me, the whole point, to Mr. Harris's point, and I don't disagree with him, except for the fact that when you're at a polling place, everything's transparent. The light is shining. But when it's by mail, the reason they're not showing any fraud is because you can't catch it, because you can't see what's going on, and anybody could be voting those ballots and mailing them in. I mean, to me, there's so many opportunities for things to get messed up. And what happens when a bunch of ballots come in after the polls close on election day? What if they come in a week later? Do they get counted? What if they come in a month later? There's just a myriad of reasons why I think voting by mail makes no sense. It sounds good until you start thinking about it.
Thank you. Mr. Harris, I saw you shaking your head, so address that.
Again, when you understand fully how it works and all the checks and balances, nobody can sign. Someone would have to forge your name. And if they don't sign exactly, when it goes through that machine, it picks up your signature. And the moment it picks up the signature, if it does not match, it kicks that ballot out. And you are immediately called. I've been called. And you have to go down to the election office and verify that's your signature and that's your ballot. And so that's why the state of Washington has it doesn't have anything to do with the Attorney General. It has to do with the fact that they've gotten so proficient at it, as has Oregon, Utah. I don't think you can get much redder than Utah. And they've gotten so good at it that they catch your signature and it kicks that ballot out. So just anybody can't fill that out and sign it because your signature must match when it goes through the machine. And
so did somebody try to vote your ballot? So did somebody try to vote your ballot and they kicked it out, caught it? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. If someone tried to vote my ballot and sign my name, you have to sign twice. Mm-hmm. And so when that ballot goes through, there's a barcode that registers that. There's an affidavit there you fill out verifying I actually signed it. And if that signature does not match, it kicks that ballot out when it goes through the machine. The election officer gets it. He calls you to verify that you vote this ballot. You have to literally go down to the election office and verify that is your ballot.
Thank you.
Seems like it's so much easier to go to the polling place.
10 years without any fraud cases. That sounds pretty good versus 8 here, you know.
Thank you both. Mr. Revell?
Yes.
If you remember the question.
Could you repeat it, please?
We were discussing a study in the Lancet that found that coronavirus only lives for 3 hours on paper. It's possible that the virus's lifespan would be shorter in real world conditions. So what evidence do you have that the virus would spread through the mail? And why is that different than being at the poll?
Personally, I don't have any evidence that other than what I've read, and I do a lot of journal reading, but when the test is non-specific, that a common cold virus can trigger a positive COVID, that does not lead me to believe that we are in as gross a pandemic as that is touted to be.
Ms. Letson?
I'm going to deviate from the question because I saw a question come across the chat that I want to make sure we answer.
Please.
And that was, isn't it too late anyway? Why are we talking about getting mail-in ballots? It is not too late to get a mail-in ballot for the November election in Texas. The deadline is October 23rd for your application to be in the election administrator's office. If you are thinking of voting a mail-in ballot and you qualify under Texas law, then apply for that mail-in ballot right now, immediately, and make sure your application is on file so that it can be sent out to you at the earliest possible moment. It is not too late to get a mail-in ballot. And I am no scientist and do not know about how the virus spreads from paper. I just think that there should be the chance to vote in person if that is what you want, and the chance to vote by mail if that's what you want.
Thank you. Mr. Land?
I really am not a scientist either. I feel like that if we allow people to vote by mail as their choice, then they will feel better about it themselves. And then if people want to go into the polls and vote, feeling like there are issues with ballots or whatever, that's their choice. And so we should be able to make that choice.
Thank you. And thank you to all the panelists. We're drawing toward the end of our time together this evening, so let's have our closing statements from the panelists, keeping them to 60 seconds or less. And let's start with Mr. Harris.
I just want to close by saying, at the end of the day, I believe everyone who is eligible to vote ought to have the right to vote. And we ought to ensure that they have that opportunity to vote. We ought to engage in whatever method or allow whatever method is secure, as long as it's secure. I don't like fraud any more than anybody else. And I always want to make sure that our elections are secure and that they're done with the utmost security at mind. And so for me, whether it's mail-in, whether it's going to the poll, at the end of the day, I want to make sure that it's secure. Because if we're against mail-in ballots, then we must also be against absentee ballot, which then cuts out our military, it cuts out many of our seniors and many of those who may not be able to get to the poll, be out of the country, or live in some other place around the world. And so we ought to give an opportunity to everybody to be able to vote.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers?
Well, I just think that responsible citizens should come to the polls to vote. Absentee ballots are different. They have applied because they're unique and can't be at the polling place anytime during early voting or on election day. And that's totally different than what we're talking about. And that to me is used to confuse the voter because it sounds logical when in reality it's not. I believe we should have transparency where people can see you at the polls, make sure there's no fraud, where you have poll watchers. Either party can have poll watchers to make sure everything's going the way it should be. And I think that's the way it ought to be. And I'm just against mail-in ballots because nobody's been I've asked several times on this panel, what about ballots that show up 2 weeks late? They don't get counted. And that way, that's wrong. And I think everybody's vote should count, and you do it on election day.
Thank you. Mr. Land?
COVID-19 is testing our democracy. By taking the steps needed to expand mail voting, which ensures safe polling places ahead of the November election, we can prevent it from also undermining our democracy.
Thank you. Mr. Revell?
Yes, I agree that I think everybody that wants to vote should be able to vote. And I think that Texas has enough options that are open to them right now without adding massive mail-in ballots.
Thank you. Ms. Letson?
I have 5 main points. If you qualify for a ballot by mail, apply now. When you get that ballot, as soon as you know who you want to vote for, vote that ballot and send it in right away. If you don't qualify for a ballot by mail, vote early. Vote during non-peak hours. So don't go right at lunch or right after work. Early voting has been extended October 13th through 30th. You'll have lots of opportunities. Third, check your polling place. It may have changed. The counties may not be able to use the same ones, so check before you go. Fourth, vote safely. Wear your mask. Bring your own hand sanitizer. Try not to do too much touching of surfaces, but go vote some way, either in person or by mail. Fifth, be a poll worker. If you can be a poll worker, these are paid positions. Do that. Help us out. And watch out for misinformation, but go vote.
Thank you, and thank you all. Commissioner Vaughn, any final thoughts? Oh, you turn on your microphone.
Just to all the panelists, I want to thank you so much for your engagement. When I had this idea, I wanted to put it out for a discussion, because it is not only a local, but it's a national discussion. And there are many variables. There are a lot of good points on all of you made, but at least we got it out there. At least we are getting the conversation out there, and we're scrubbing the issue. Obviously, it wasn't a thought that we would have mass voting mailing at this election. We knew that. It's the time does not preclude us from doing so, but we can begin to have a discussion and work toward a means to that every citizen will have the opportunity to vote in any capacity they wanted to. So I just want to thank all of you. Thank Steve, thank Tim, Anthony, Dan, Sonya, and most of all, also thank Karen and PBS for putting this on, moderating it for us, did an excellent job. And everybody, regardless of how you do it, go vote. It is so very important.
Thank you. I add my thanks to our panelists for their participation this evening and to our audiences who appear to have had a good chat and had lots of questions for us. A reminder, I'm gonna remind like Sonya has, Election Day is November 3rd. Early voting begins October 13th and will run through October 30th. If you meet Texas' current requirements for voting by mail, you must apply, and your completed application must be received by election officials by October 23rd. If you're voting by mail, your completed ballot must be postmarked by 7 p.m. November 3rd. As you know, we at Panhandle PBS have a mission to educate and inform our community, and during the pandemic, we have found new and creative ways to do that safely. We have partnered, as Sonya mentioned before, with the Amarillo League of Women Voters to help present the League's candidate forum on it's not October 13th, on October 6th. We moved it back a week, or up a week. So that League of Women Voters forum, candidates forum, will be October 6th. And Sonya, any other details you'd like to share about that?
Voters guides will also be coming out. You will be able to find a paper voters guide before early voting starts, and you can always go online to vote411.org, which is the League's online voters guide, and find out all about the candidates, polling places, election dates, even register to vote there. So we look forward to presenting all the education we can to our citizens in the Amarillo Canyon area.
Okay, thank you for adding that information. I would also like to let you know that this broadcast has been recorded, this forum, and it will be available as soon as possible, as soon as we can get it up on our YouTube channel, Panhandle PBS News YouTube channel, excuse me, and also our website, panhandlepbs.org. So thank you everyone and good evening.